Alan is one of the most experienced experts in our field. He invented decision requirements diagrams and describes them in his famous book. He is a co-author and the co-chair of the DMN standard. And for years, Alan is a technical lead of the FICO decisioning platform. It gives him unique opportunity to present theoretical and practical issues related to decision management. And I want to stress one more aspect. I like to meet with Alan face-to-face. But surprisingly, instead of discussing purely technical issues, we usually talk more about humanitarian issues. So no wonder today, Alan will talk about ethical decision-making. Looking forward to this, Alan.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you. The more eagle-eyed of you may have noticed that the title of this paper has changed since Jacob first published the schedule. My original title was just Decision Models for Ethical Decision-Making, but of course that was much too vast an area to cover in one paper. To be frank, I just hadn't quite decided where I was going to apply myself when Jacob rang me up to tell me that it was time to submit my abstract. So I'm going to focus on the implications of the upcoming European Commission Artificial Intelligence Act, and in particular on the way in which it deals with transparency. We would all like to believe that, provided there exists a clear statement of a set of accepted ethical principles, that we would all behave according to those principles and we'd have well-behaved companies. Unfortunately, of course, we all know that this is not the case. We can't just trust companies to do the right thing. If we want companies to behave ethically, we need to create legislation which encodes our ethical principles, and we need to insist that companies comply with it. And it's that compliance with the legislation which guarantees ethical behavior. So I'm going to look at how ethical principles around transparency have been encoded in the EC/AI Act and how companies can ensure compliance with the Act. If this sends you to sleep during the next 50 minutes, I apologize, but I promise you that this issue will be keeping a lot of us awake at night for years to come. Of course, we're all aware that the last few years have seen growing unease around the use of AI, with words like algorithm coming into common use with a slightly pejorative tone. People are quite rightly expecting that if AI is used to make decisions about them, those decisions should be ethical and justifiable. The European Commission has responded to this surprisingly speedily. In 2018, they set up a high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, the AIHLEG, which is perhaps the most unpronounceable acronym ever. It consists of about 50 people from academia, industry, and government. And this group has certainly worked quickly and effectively. Following year, 2019, they released their ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. And in 2020, they published a white paper explaining how those principles will be mapped into a piece of legislation. The proposal was published last year. It is actually entitled A Proposal for a Regulation of the European Parliament Laying Down Harmonized Rules on Artificial Intelligence. And this document, the 2021 proposal, is the complete proposed text for the legislation. The final document in my timeline here is not from HLEG, but from GovAI, but it is an interesting paper, which I recommend. It argues that the influence of the EC/AI Act will be felt not just in Europe, but globally, just as it was with GDPR. It points to de facto effects. Essentially, it's not in the interests of providers to support two versions of AI software, one to be EU compliant and the other not. And de jure affects the adoption of similar legislation elsewhere in the world, either for compatibility or simplicity. So this was HLEG's approach. In their ethics guidelines, they listed 4 basic ethical principles: respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability. And then they described 7 requirements that AI systems must satisfy if they are to be seen as trustworthy by people. These are human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. In the proposed AI Act, these 7 requirements are mapped to 7 legal requirements to be placed upon the providers of AI. And then those in turn are distilled into a number of prohibitions and obligations. As a result of this downward approach, the prohibitions and obligations in the Act can be traced back to the original ethical principles. And as we'll see, that's really useful when you're trying to understand how it all works. Let's start with some definitions. So what does the HLEG mean by an AI system? They define it as software that is developed with one or more of the techniques and approaches listed in Annex 1 and can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, generate outputs such as content predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing the environments they interact with. So if you look at the annex, you find the AI techniques and approaches of these. So there's machine learning, logic and knowledge-based approaches, and statistical approaches. So note that even though media attention has been focused on machine learning, to the extent that the word AI has become synonymous with ML, the European Commission does not use the term AI in this way. It uses it to include rule-based approaches and statistical approaches. They then define a subclass of high-risk AI systems. And first of all, they say that any use of AI in a product which is already subject to European safety legislation is to be considered high risk. And then they list a number of specific other listed areas, as you see here, so biometrics, management of infrastructure, education, and so on. It's a somewhat idiosyncratic list. I rather expect that as the Act is reviewed, there'll be a few other areas added to it, or some of these will be generalized. But note that one of these, access to and enjoyment of essential private services and public services and benefits, includes checks on creditworthiness. So we must not think that high-risk AI systems is a small group. As Gregor said earlier, they will include the vast majority of business applications of AI. So let's have a look at how transparency is addressed in the obligations placed on the providers of high-risk AI systems and how these can be traced back to the ethical principles that they started out with. The obligations section of the Act contains only one single statement relevant to transparency, and it's this one. Chapter 3, Article 16A. Providers of high-risk AI systems shall ensure that their high-risk AI systems are compliant with the requirements set out in Chapter 2. In other words, it tells us nothing. It just points back to the requirements of that Act. So the requirements chapter does actually have a section on transparency, which says, rather more usefully, high-risk AI systems shall be sufficiently transparent to enable users to interpret the system's output and use it appropriately. An appropriate type and degree of transparency shall be ensured. So this tells us that transparency has something to do with enabling users to interpret its output, but it doesn't provide a definition of transparency as such, and it certainly doesn't say what an appropriate type and degree of it would be. So to get a handle on that, we need to go back to the guidelines. The guidelines break transparency down into three quite separate areas: traceability, explainability, and communication. So traceability is a well understood concept in software, but note that here it does not mean simply a trace of the logic executed by a decision service. It includes documentation of the data that were involved in making the decisions and the surrounding processes. Explainability is characterized with three requirements, all of which have important implications. It needs to be able to be understood by human beings. It needs to be adapted to the expertise of the stakeholder, in other words, the person who is being explained to. There might be a layperson, a regulator, or a researcher, for example. And it needs to explain both the technical processes of the AI system and the related human decisions, which I think is a really interesting point to make. So I'll come back to all of these in a moment. And the third area is communication, which is about being open about the fact that AI is being used and being open about its capabilities and its limitations. And finally, if we get right back to the top, to the original ethical principles, we see that the EC has accepted that there is a degree of nuance around explainability. So it says, it uses the phrase, to the extent possible, decisions need to be explainable. And it says that some models are it's not always possible to generate an explanation, especially black box algorithms. It doesn't say that you can't use them. It actually says that it's not always possible to generate an explanation. So other explicability measures may be required, provided that the system as a whole respects fundamental rights. And these are the fundamental rights of the Euro Commission, which are dignity, freedoms, equality and solidarity, citizens' rights, and justice. And finally here, the degree to which explicability is needed is highly dependent on the context. So an interestingly nuanced expression of the role and the necessity for explainability. So let's look again at the implications of the requirements for transparency. Firstly, that we need to explain AI and related human decisions. This means we must explain our decisions in the context of the business processes and case management actions taking place on the case. Must be understandable by human beings. That means the explanation must be based on common business concepts, not technical language. And it needs to be adapted to the expertise of the stakeholder, which means the explanation has to be tailored to the particular occurrence of explanation that's going on, providing variable degrees of detail, maybe different types of language. Now, those of you who know me will not be surprised by the conclusion I draw from these implications. To satisfy these requirements, explanations must be based on models of the decision-making process. So how does a model-based approach help us to provide explanations which will satisfy the requirements of the EC AI Act? First point I want to be clear about is that I'm not just talking about automatically generated explanations, although this is an important field, and it's one which has been covered in a number of presentations to this conference, including the paper by Jan Purchas and David Petchy last year. Decision models can also support human caseworkers in explaining decisions to their customers by making the structure and the context of the decisions immediately clear to the agent. And that's going to be a really important use of decision models. As Denise said earlier, we need to support our knowledge workers. The second point is that if we are using models for openness and transparency, they must be expressed in open standards like BPMN+. So BPMN, CMMN, and DMN together allow models to be composed from other models through recursion and encapsulation. And so allow explanations to be as simple or as detailed as is required in any particular situation. You should imagine a set of models describing the business process and all its sub-processes, the case management activities involved in handling the case, along with all the human interactions and decisions, the structure of automated decisions made on the case, and the decision logic used to make those decisions, rules, calculations, and analytic models. Together, these models allow a very complete explanation indeed. For example, a truly complete explanation generated from a set of BPMN plus models might be, hi, our AI system made this set of decisions on your case using these business rules, these calculations, and these score models based on these data, which we collected from these sources in the context of this event occurring in this business transaction, resulting in this case referral, and that's why I'm contacting you about this issue. To which the typical customer will respond, pardon? To the Americans in the audience, that's the English idiom for WTF. A more typical use of explanation might go like this. Hi, I'm calling you so that we can take a closer look at your application. Why? Your application has been flagged as showing borderline affordability. What does that mean? Your repayments will be roughly equal to your disposable income. What can I do about that? You can either reduce the loan amount or increase the term of the loan or show us evidence of other income. What term would make my repayments affordable? And so on. This is a conversation, not a single explanation. Looking at that conversation, we can draw a number of conclusions. An explanation is not a trace. An explanation is an answer to a question. And different types of question require different types of answer. So we have logical explanations, which are what we normally think of as explanation when we're talking about automatic generation of explanations. How did you derive my risk score? What was that risk? How was the risk combined with affordability to make the final decision? We understand how those sorts of things work. Then there are temporal types of explanation based on time. What sequence of events led to this? What stages has my application already gone through? Then the teleological explanation, explanation of the purposes of what's going on. Why are you asking me for these documents? And then there's counterfactual explanation, what if things. How would the decision change if the case data were different? Any explanation of any of these types can be given to various depths, that is, various levels of detail. And an explanation can consist simply of a request for clarification of the terms that are used. Finally, it can simply be asking for what options have I got at this point. Note that explanations will often segue into other types of conversation. We saw that in the example. This provides value to both participants in the conversation, both the individual and the entity, the corporate entity they're talking to. Looking at the user orientation of explanation, explanations must be tailored to the user. The user might be a customer, it might be an agent, it might be an auditor. All of these people have different needs by way of explanation. They understand different types of language, and they have different rights to information. So different types of user use different vocabulary, different levels of expertise, and differing rights of access to information. Models separate domain knowledge from vocabulary, question syntax, and access rights. Separating these things allows us to tailor the explanations to the user, taking account of their language, the level of technical understanding or their role, but using the same underlying decision models. It's a very powerful way of formulating what it is you're trying to explain. So how transparent is transparent enough? How can a model-based approach help with governance? Governance requires that our AI systems be assessed against some objective benchmark. The benchmark needs to be defined, documented, and then you can check compliance against it. How can we assess the degree of transparency? And how do we define an appropriate degree of transparency, both of which are referred to in the legislation without being properly defined? I'm going to propose two practical definitions based on a model-based approach to explanation. A degree of transparency is simply the proportion of the organization's model of its decision-making that is exposed to the user, that is able to be questioned and described. And an appropriate degree of transparency is a degree of transparency which is enough to guarantee the user's fundamental rights, but which affords the provider with necessary secrecy and reasonable protection of IP. Note that some AI systems will involve some logic which must be kept secret in order to avoid, say, reverse engineering by criminals. I've worked on such systems myself where the government has defined certain rules and they do not want everybody to know what these are. And companies also have rights to protection of certain types of IP, even though we should be able to generate an explanation which tells that the person involved something about how the decision was made. This last point, I think, is the one which invites most controversy. So let's drill down in a bit more into what it means for compliance. It's down to each company to decide what an appropriate degree of transparency is in any particular scenario, to justify the choice of that degree, and to make a formal commitment to that degree of transparency which is capable of being audited. So for the purposes of compliance with the Act, each organization must decide what levels of their model to expose. So if you imagine that great tree of models with submodels, encapsulated models, and so on, how much of that are you actually going to expose to be questioned by your users? Are there certain parts of it you're going to protect? Are you just going to take it down to a certain level of detail, and so on? And the model you expose, should that be the actual model which is executed by your AI system? Or should it be some version of it which is simplified or maybe slightly changed in order to make it more explainable? In my experience, for example, a lot of business processes involve details which are completely irrelevant to most users. If there's some sub-process to do with synchronizing databases with a set of data that's come in, that's of no interest to anybody. It'd be quite sensible to leave that out of the model which is exposed. And with decision models, I find that there are certain ways in which decision making is broken down for the purposes of execution, which could probably be simplified in a decision model for explanation of the final decisions. And finally, what components should be protected? As I say, there will be certain areas where the company may wish to protect certain pieces of intellectual property. So there may be little black boxes amongst the decision model, either which is being kept from public gaze or which is not easy to make transparent. But of course, each organization can also decide to go further than the minimum. They can provide as much transparency as they wish, but being able to express it in terms of the degree of their decision model which is exposed makes that decision clear. So here's a set of 3 example degrees of transparency. The compliance with the Act will require that the explanation facilities of an AI system are audited against a statement of compliance. Achieving compliance for explanation to an auditor will require that we expose the full executed model with no hidden logic. The auditor, you can provide a trace in technical vocabulary, and we can generate that decision, that explanation at decision time. So the auditor is entitled to see the full trace. They're capable of understanding the full trace, and they don't need it expressed in particularly business-ready language. At least that's one possibility. But that's a very different customer, if you like, from somebody who is having decisions made about them for, let's say, a loan. If you want to achieve compliance of explainability for a normal customer, you need to provide a simplified model. You need to hide certain parts of the detail. You may be permitted to preserve certain intellectual property. You're going to have to use vernacular explanations rather than technical ones, using widely comprehensible language. You may have to provide that in a number of different languages, but you can probably still generate it at decision time. In other words, you can generate sentences describing how decisions were made for each component of the decision making, and you can compose those sentences up to a full decision explanation tree, which can then be shared at various details during the process of explanation. But if you really want to achieve excellence for explanation to customers, then you need to go further still. You need a model which is expandable to various levels, but still preserving certain IP. And I mean expandable at the time of questioning rather than in advance. You need the ability to answer all sorts of questions, not just logical questions, but temporal, teleological, and so on, using vocabulary which might be adjusted at question time. So as you learn more about your customer, you might be able to use different language. So these things need to be done at the time of interaction with the customer. And you can see here that we're dealing with a real conversation where you learn about your customer in real time and adjust your explanation to them. So in conclusion, I want to make the point that decision modeling provides all the participants in the domain with an opportunity. Firstly, regulators and standards bodies. Of course, I'm talking of one standards body in particular in this forum, should be able to provide guidelines to supporting explainability based on their standards, and benchmarks on what adequate explainability would look like when applied to those types of models. Might even provide tools for generating such systems. The key opportunity, though, I think, is that model-based explanation provides a very simple means to assess compliance. You can look at a model and you can see very clearly what it is that's being exposed, whereas systems that generate text out of black boxes are far harder to assess. From the point of view of providers, model-based explanation simplifies compliance, and in particular the declaration of compliance. So the provider can state clearly exactly what it is that they're exposing, how they're going to generate explanations from it, and they can commit to providing that degree of explanation. And then they can, it allows them to gradually improve their explanation over time. They can actually produce a staged roadmap from adequate explainability to excellent explainability, because this will take some time to do. And thirdly, it allows componentization of AI solutions. What I mean by that is that if we separate the model on which the explanation is based from the process of generating an explanation from it, we can separate the decision service from the explanation service. And the medium of exchange between those two is the model, which is exposed, and the case data for the case which is being explained. So you can imagine an explanation generating facility which takes an open standards model of the decision-making solution and the data which exists about the case, and can explain how that solution will have reached these decisions about that case. And from the user's point of view, we can provide better support for caseworkers when dealing with customers. I want to reinforce this point. I'm not just talking about automatically generated explanations. I'm also talking about explanations by people. And I think if we provide, for example, caseworkers with a simple DRD of the decisions made in a case, annotated with the results of each decision, that provides a much better basis for an explanation to somebody on the phone than any textual or listing of items, because they can scan that down through this diagram and they can see immediately where the issue has arisen that the customer is responding to. And from the customer's point of view, which we must remember is the point of this legislation, they get real conversations and useful explanations. So that's it. Thank you. I've also provided a page of references for this afterwards, but that's it for my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. That was great. Really enjoyed that. We have a question actually off the top from Jacob over in the Slack channel, and he is asking if your slide about conversational explanations is supported by the actual capabilities of the FICO platform.
No, Jacob, I must be quite clear. As far as I know, this isn't supported by the actual capabilities of any platform. I'm talking about where the market needs to go if we are to provide the levels of transparency which are going to be required by the Act.
Okay, that's what I thought. It's first time when I see such specification for all vendors, and I'm thinking how difficult it could be to implement such dialogue, especially when explanations coming from different sources. It's right now it does not look for me realistic with the design of majority of our platforms. It requires something else. Probably in knowledge representation, we need to look deeper. It's not even dictionary, it's much more, and that's why we working for many years with our partners in declarative AI on RuleML and RR. And by the way, it would be next session and keynote would be on declarative AI, and probably using ontology. That's the only way to support such features what you're talking about.
I agree, and that's why I put this at the end of a hypothetical roadmap. In fact, that example conversation I gave goes further than the Act requires, let's be clear. I think that an adequate explanation is probably just the logical side of things for the moment.
Yeah.
Could be done without using those technologies. But
Okay.
I agree. But we need to be looking to support our customers better than the minimum that can be done with these current technologies.
Just following on with that theme about the Act, Gregor had a question in Slack that there was a bit of a scare a few years ago around GDPR and the right to explanation. And do you think we'll see something similar with the AI Act? Like in practice, it'll be mostly fine, but people will get kind of all worked up about it in advance.
Absolutely, people will get worked up about it. And the way all legislation works is that the wording of the legislation is never quite clear. It's ambiguous and amenable to various interpretations. So we'll have to wait for case law to accumulate around it. And I think, in fact, that's one of the reasons I wanted to present this paper at this conference, is that it's up to us to propose a sensible and working interpretation of the Act and to show how that can be done. If we can show a corpus of best practice, we can keep ahead of the game and produce something that's workable.
So there's a number of questions in Slack, and I'm going to try to bring them together a little bit. So Jan sort of started it off saying companies don't even have people or time to answer transaction questions. Where are they going to find time to give explanations and conversations? And then Bob said that it's far harder to explain how decisions are reached rather than reaching this, and that this is how people explain their own decisions. And Ron Ross came in and said, what do you think about natural language support with this in terms of transparency? So I think this is all about how do we get people to, how do we capture those explanations that have to go behind the decisions?
Yes. Okay, so the time issue, not quite sure whether Jan's referring to computation time or real time.
I think it was around real time, about where would they find the time to give explanations and conversations, so that having people just who can dedicate some time to do that. Yeah,
well, in my experience, most of the scenarios in which you need to explain things to people are not within this main happy path of a half-second decision on something. They arise when a customer asks a question and is expecting a conversation that takes some time. In fact, one of the problems we have is that we're trying to deal with people too quickly at the moment, but we need to give them time and give them a satisfactory explanation.
Well, and I think that, Bob's point that it's harder to explain how decisions are reached sometime than reaching them. And definitely, I'm more on the process side than the decision side, but what we see all the time is that there's knowledge workers who are making a decision, like a human decision at some point. But if you ask them to explain how that decision was made, it might be very difficult to get that kind of explanation out of them about exactly how that was made.
I think Bob's point is right on the button. It's certainly far harder to explain decisions than to make them. Mm-hmm. And that's why, Gregor handled this very nicely in his talk on the various techniques. We need to choose techniques which are explainable, and put ourselves in a position where it is possible to explain our decisions. And the same goes for human decisions, actually. A human decision should not be so unstructured that it is impossible to justify it as somebody.
Right, it still has to be explainable. It's not like, oh, which way is the wind blowing? I'll make that decision today. It has to be based on those, whatever your regulations are or whatever. And I found Ron's point interesting, just about the potential use of natural language support to maybe capture some of those explanations and conversations. Are you seeing anything like that?
I think it will be necessary. Yes, I think the technology we're seeing develop already in chatbots, but the trouble is that the knowledge underlying what chatbots come up with is very primitive at the moment. If we combine the natural language abilities of chatbots with the model-based explanation, then I think we're going to be getting there.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay,
I mean,
good.
just to clarify my second point, Alan, what I was really saying was that if we use machines to make decisions, then we actually have the potential of being able to explain them in terms of the model. If we ask human beings to make decisions, the chances of getting them to sensibly explain why they reach their decisions is very small in practice.
And
So-
I would completely agree with that, Bob, having looked at like how decisions get made at points in process where I'm usually coming at it from the process side. And then we get to that activity where it's a person, a knowledge worker doing something. And you're like, well, how does that work exactly? And they can't explain it.
Yeah, I think this is part of what CMMN ought to be about, is structuring the caseworker's role so that they have certain procedures that they have to carry out, certain areas of information they have to collect, and that they have to justify their reasoning.
Right. And so there's guardrails around if there are human decisions, that there's guardrails around those decisions, which would be informed by decision management.
Indeed.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. If you have any other last questions for Alan, definitely raise your hand. Or if you want to put anything else over on Slack, Alan, you probably would just want to take a look and see if we've missed any nuances of what's on Slack there. Now we have about 20 minutes before the keynote starts. For the keynote, you're going to need to go over to the WebEx. And I put the link both on Slack and in the Zoom chat, and it's also on the program page. So there's a link to a WebEx, and this is for Paul Vincent's keynote on the evolution of decisioning in IT. And that's going to be starting at the top of the hour. And then we will be back an hour later and get kicked off with Bob Moore's presentation right after lunch Eastern time, or probably after dinner for you people in Europe.
Looking forward to it, Bob.
Okay, as we still have few, okay, I want just to make a note that we still have a few minutes. This is what Alan presented, and he put more questions, and most of us and he himself cannot provide answers. And this is probably the best presentation when we looking in the future at DecisionCAMP, when we asking questions and don't have answers today. And hopefully, if somebody can tell from vendors right now that they're working on this, or they have some kind of idea how to implement what Alan said, it could be great. But it's really one of my takeaway point is that we really for 20 years, we're doing basically the same. We did not change dramatically our core of our systems. And probably it's time, questions like what Alan brought, force us to rethink our inside architecture of all our products. And hopefully we will see this in the future, if not today. But that's something that many vendors think about. And I hope maybe on next DecisionCAMP, we will hear some preliminary answers. Thank you, Alan, for this.
Thanks, Jacob.
Okay, so we're going to leave the Zoom session open. We'll be gone for an hour and a quarter, but definitely pop over and